Right, thank you everyone for joining us for our third panel session. Excited about this. We're going to be talking about the Lyell collection, mapping and extracting the content from the Lyell papers. And our panelist is made up of Elise Ramsey, who's our Charles Lyell Project archivist, Darrell Green, who's our head of special collections and deputy head of the Centre of Research Collections here at the University of Edinburgh, and Elaine McGilvery, who is the senior Lyell archivist. So, to start the conversation off, I'm going to say that purchasing the Lyell collection was a big fundraising effort that we were so thrilled to have succeeded with. Daryl, can you tell us what the aims for the collection are now that we have the notebooks?
Yeah, that's right, INP. So the notebooks themselves, they were purchased, but we also have added to the collection as well. So we've been able to add a significant portion of letters and archives and correspondence to Lyle and his family. I mean, really, the aim is to try and make the collection accessible from as wide an angle as possible. So, you know, to those who might be interested in the history of geosciences, to those that are interested in the history of, you know, ideas and exchange. So we've got a very large project that's on the go that both Elaine and Elise are deeply involved with in terms of providing and creating access to the collections. That's through archival description, that's through conservation, that's through digital imaging, and through engagement as well.
Amazing, amazing. So, there's quite a lot of preparatory work that needs to happen before the team can get to the transcription of the notebooks. Elaine, can you tell us what some of the preparatory steps were that were essential before you started the transcription of the notebooks?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things to remember is that the transcription project that Elise has been so heavily involved in, the editor project, was a pilot to see how we could get this to work in the first instance. But there are, quite a significant number of steps to do before that. One of the first ones is mapping the collections. So as Darrell mentioned, there's a number of different elements to the collection. So there's the notebooks, the 294 notebooks, which we purchased through the fundraising campaign. And then we have a significant body of material, which we acquired through the UK's acceptance in lieu of inheritance tax scheme. And then there was also the earlier material, which we received as early as 1927. And we've since received further accruals, which have come in from different places. So it's really important to have a really good handle on the extent of all that material, the format that it makes up, to know, where it's located, and then also to then be able to look at, okay, what do we need to do to catalogue it, to get the metadata that we need in order to digitise the notebooks. So we have to have a certain amount of metadata first. We were struck by having to catalogue remotely because of the pandemic. So we did things probably a bit back to front compared to what other projects may have done, in that we digitised a lot of material first so that Elise could work with that from home and catalogue from home. But we had a minimal amount of metadata on the digitised images that allowed us to match up the notebooks with the catalogue descriptions. And then you're looking across the collections to see where, referring back to Mike's earlier point earlier in the day about how do we make big data sets, open and available. So we're looking across the collection to sort of do an assessment of, okay, where are the quick wins in this collection? And doing that, keeping in mind what's practical from a technological point of view, from the cataloguing point of view, but also thinking about what the research needs are for the collection, and how the collection, trying to anticipate some of how the collection is going to be used. You can't always do all of that. But the notebooks were, a really great quick win, because it's a significant body of material which we can then use to build the model within Transcribers to create transcriptions, which we can then apply to, we're going to look at doing the correspondence next, which is also another significant body of material, which provides two fantastic data sets that can be used for a number of different research purposes. But I think, definitely to when you're looking at transcription, you have to factor in those preparatory stages of making sure you know what's in your collection, the cataloguing and the digitisation as well, and all of the workflows involved in those processes before you even get to using transcribers.
Oh my.
Can I jump in there just really quickly? Yeah, so I mean, the other thing that's really great about the notebooks, I mean, and this, we learned as we started to explore the notebooks, and Elise has already pointed this out in earlier presentations, is that Lyle's hand is all over the place in the notebooks. We've got samples of his handwriting for 3/4 of his life, but two, in his notebooks, he's got very scribbly field note hand. He's got draft letter hand. It's all over the place. So in order to kind of create the deepest model possible for transcribers, the notebooks are actually a really good corpus for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'll
Crazy.
just jump in there as well, just to say that the notebooks, because of the way that Lyle kept his notebooks, he knew that they needed to be referenced. Now, we don't know if he knew they wanted to be referenced by himself or he planned for others to use them, but he spent an incredible amount of time creating indexes in each of these notebooks. And the last 30 notebooks are indexes of indexes across the collection. And so he really is, I call him the archivist geologist, is because he really made our work cut out for us in the sense of this is where we need to start. And it happened in this sequence because we had the notebooks first and the correspondence came second. But in that way, the priorities were easily matched in that by focusing on the notebooks, which has been my focus on the project, we're unlocking such a rich collection that is across his magnificent 45-year career of work and of labor. And so if you find a letter later on, you can find the exact notebook that relates to. And that's so rare, it really is. So that really matches into another reason why we started with the notebooks.
That's amazing. And can you tell us how far through digitizing and transcribing the notebooks you are, Elise?
Sure. So as I said about the indexes, these were our sort of focus on how we can extract this data as each notebook is digitized. Our priority in cataloging was on those indexes because ultimately a reader would be able to recall the exact notebook page they wanted to look at by seeing that Lyle had written that he would talk about ichthyosaurus fossils on page 66. And so they could go to that particular page in the digital record and be able to access it in that way. So that was why we focused on those. And so I have transcribed along with Nikki Monroe, who was a volunteer on the project last semester. And we've transcribed over about 7 of the indexes manually before Transcribus was available. And so in working with that again was slower than Transcribus certainly, but much quicker than a full transcription of the notebooks, which I had done previously in March. So it certainly was another way of understanding all the subjects and the agents in which Lyle uses, and to create an understanding which we can now employ now using Transcribus.
That's amazing. So we've got a question from Alison who's asking, did you use Transcribus to interpret handwritten metadata about the collection? For example, existing handwritten catalogues and lists. We have many handwritten catalogues and registers in our collections. Transcribing them would be really helpful to unlock our collections.
Do you want me to take that, Elise? I'm quite happy. So the short answer is yes and no. So to take one part of it first, so when we acquired the likes of the correspondence, they came with a number of different sets of metadata, some which were in Excel spreadsheets and others which were handwritten lists. And the way that we're going to approach those is we've converted the Excel data sets into the ISAG, which is the International Standard of Archival Description, compliant data sets that we can then import into our online catalogue archive space. With the handwritten lists, I think what we'll do is we'll use that as a student engagement experience or a volunteer project to have them typed up into an Excel spreadsheet in the same format that we can use ISAG compliant, and then we can import them again into archive space. But in terms of the metadata, which is within the notebooks themselves, such as the Charles Lyell's own indexes, then we've included that information in the archive space catalogue descriptions. But I think we need to do some exploration of how that's pulled through in the catalogue descriptions. And I think Elise can talk more about how that works in terms of the transcription that she's done, the transcription model, because those indexes obviously have been included in the transcription work. Do you want to say a bit more about that, Elise?
Yeah, I think this is an element that we now need to work with our own team in archive space, and there are now new capabilities, which archive space, which is the Center for Research Collections catalogue database. There are new possibilities now, and so transcribers can be exported to XML, EAD, and TEI. And so as we start to put together this workflow and how we will use these transcriptions now, the questions really arise as to sort of how they'll be pulled through, what information is really key. For example, the indexes, the full transcription would probably be far too much to host on the catalog, but perhaps a link to where the transcriptions can be found. We spoke about big data, and to be able to search across these collections, across the notebook and across the correspondence, would be able to pull out some fascinating new narratives, which we can't even imagine at the moment, of his work on different subjects, all of the different entities and people who he's in correspondence with. There's so much more to explore with those things available.
Amazing. Wow. So having a corpus of the notebooks help us create a great model of Lyell's handwriting, which we of course be making open source. Daryl, can you tell us what the next steps are for the other Lyell content that we have at the Center for Research Collections and institutions elsewhere that might have some Lyell content?
Yeah, at least I can start it off, and then probably hand over to Elaine. As we alluded to, we've got a lot of other Lyell material that has come in, which will help enrich the model of Lyell's own hand. But there's also, a large corpus of letters from, for example, his wife, Mary Horner Lyell. And so, there is a potential to run and create models on her hands or on several other, people who are regular correspondents with Lyell. So, within this collection, there's the ability to potentially create, several models for 19th century handwriting, letter handwriting. Beyond that, though, we're also really aware that there are Lyell letters, Lyell correspondence dotted all over the place. There's some places where these have accrued over time. So, for example, the American Philosophical Society's library, New Zealand. It's where he was corresponding with people, so where his letters ended up. And ideally, we're going to make this model open source, but ideally we'd like to be able to roll that out or provide that to other folks so that they could ingest their material into Transcribus as well.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that. And I think one of the really exciting prospects of having the notebooks transcribed is the enhanced searchability of the notebooks. Now, we have at the Coburn Geological Museum in the University of Edinburgh a set of 150 or just over 150 geological specimens, and there's also others. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, Daryl, but I think at the Natural History Museum of Oxford there's a significant geological specimen collection of Lyell's. And one of the things that we're hoping that will come out of having the transcriptions of the notebooks is the ability to search for those specimen names and be able to match up the geological specimens with where they're mentioned and talked about in the notebooks, so that we can actually have a more sort of holistic representation of how he worked and how he developed his ideas and then revised his ideas, looking at how the notebooks match up with his correspondence and also then with his published works. And Elise has pulled out some fabulous examples already of where he's trying to refine his ideas within the notebooks, and then he maybe has some correspondence with someone and you can see him refining them again, and then the culmination of all that sort of thinking and collaborating with other people appears in his published works, which are then also revised. So his Principles of Geology is there are 10 editions of Principles of Geology, and there are significant revisions in each of those published works. So having the transcriptions and the enhanced searchability will hopefully be able to allow us to connect all the different elements of the collections within our own collections and also those held elsewhere too.
And how do you merge existing transcriptions with the transcriptions created by transcribers? How do you bring it all together?
If somebody can answer that for me, I would be delighted. I think that's something that's absolutely doable given our experience of merging other data, but it's just something that we need to think through the workflow. There's a significant body of transcribed material for LILE already held in a number of different institutions, and there's been positive feedback from those institutions about sharing those transcriptions. There's obviously a number of considerations when you're looking at merging one person's work in transcribing with an automated AI tool. And there are some challenges around that, but it's definitely something that we're looking into. But if anybody has any experience of doing that, of merging existing transcriptions with this new information that's coming out through the transcribers model, please get in touch, because I'd be really interested to know what your experience is and how you've worked through that. There's Daryl's got his hand up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to backpedal really quickly. So the point that Elaine made about his published works and his kind of reworking of things, one of the things I'm really curious about Transcribus is one of our newer acquisitions is several copies of first and later editions of Lyle's work that Lyle actually wrote on himself. So he went through and made corrections, he went through and made marginal annotations, so on and so forth. And I wonder, I'm kicking this out there to the wider crowd, I wonder if Transcribus has the ability to take a scanned image of a printed page, but identify what on that page is actually, handwritten versus the printed text. So, putting Transcribus onto a not fully handwritten page, I guess, is...
Yeah, I think that's really important as well, because during that period, there's a development of how ideas are represented visually. And Lyle was really at the forefront of that in terms of his this kind of language. He's at the forefront of developing the language of science and of geology, and this vocabulary starting to emerge from his work, but also in the visual representation of his ideas. So it would be fantastic if we could use Transcribus and or another tool in some way to be able to draw that out. And that's one of the things that we'd like to see embedded in the project going forward, are student experience placements and work that looks at tackling some, engaging with our student body and our subject experts at tackling some of those issues as to where they've got the subject expertise to be able to add that additional layer of interpretation to collections material. That can be then drawn out into the catalogues and in the open source material that's available online.
So Joe Nockels has mentioned the text to image tool in Transcribers that can match XML files to text images. Do we know about that?
Yeah, we spoke about that as well. Joe and I spoke about that in the training, and that the transcription, which I had done with Gillian McKay over at the Coburn Geological Museum last year, we were actually, there is the capability of being able to import that document and line up that text with the images which we used. And we decided to do it, not to use text to image in that, mainly because it would require more training, and we were on a time, we were quite time limited. But that is an option, and instead we used sort of more cut and paste manual transcription with Transcribus at that moment. But I think if we had a large body of transcription to bring in, I'm sure that would work.
And would strengthen the model, because you know the transcription is accurate. Yeah. And so we've got, how do we build in dynamic capacity to allow for future corrections?
Oh, this is another one that I would like to know people's experience about. I think particularly with using Transcribus, we create this marvelous model which Elise has tested, and there's a really high percentage of accuracy with the model. Did you say it's about 80% accuracy, Elise, from memory?
Yeah. I would, yeah.
Yeah. So that's creating 80% accuracy, and that's with having some time on top of the actual transcription to do the editing and quality control checking of the transcription that's created. But we're obviously quite aware that despite our best efforts and intentions, we are not subject experts. And so there may be in the future, when the transcriptions are made available to a public audience, where things are noted by geologists, or fossil name might be wrong, or there's something just a bit inaccurate. And to have the capacity whereby we can feed those corrections in a sort of streamlined way. I'd be really interested to hear of other people's experience if they've got to that stage, because I think that's something we'd really like to build in, so that it's got that sort of dynamic capacity there, as opposed to putting, if we're happy with the transcriptions and they go out into the public domain, I think it would be more prudent of us to be able to say, okay, well, we know that they're not perfect. We're communicating the standard of the transcription to the public so that we're kind of managing those expectations about what they can get, but also to build in that capacity to be able to make improvements down the line, I think is really important. But we've still to explore how that might work in practice.
Yeah, Mike brought this up earlier, and it really resonated with me, is that if we only hold out for when the massive collection transcription is perfect, no one will ever see it. But it also is that balance of knowing manual transcription. When I was doing that, there were whole pages where it was very, very difficult to make out what Lyle was saying. And yet, from a professional standpoint, wanting to put that out into the public to say, we've got no idea what he's going on about here, doesn't really fit, does it? And so it's that managing the expectations and looking to our very, very knowledgeable research community who can step in and say, yes, we know exactly what he's using abbreviations, he's using shorthand, which we no longer know about. But there are people with that expertise who we want to bring on board and be able to facilitate that in a way that strengthens the research quality and strengthens the collection.
Yeah, I think that's something as well that we've learned from our colleagues at the University of Cambridge. We're very fortunate in that the director of the Darwin Correspondence Project is on our advisory board, Jim Secord. And he was also from there. We've managed to pick up quite a lot from their learning during that project. And one of the things that he was very clear about is that we should be very careful about communicating the standard of transcription and when we make the body of material available online, so that the users know what to expect and what the failings might be, and if there are corrections to be made, so that at least you're not having people, end users, coming to your site and thinking, we want to either improve this, or this is not what I expected, that kind of thing. So I think that's important to factor in as well.
He also uses many different languages. Was fluent in Latin, fluent in Italian, and had pretty good working French, at least for correspondence. And I know we have several of those languages covered off in some ways on the team, but those are areas that I'm sure we will be missing out when we go to transcribe, especially when the model is created with English as an understanding, English as the base model. And so something that is down the line for us then is how do we have to retrain a model to be able to understand those draft letters in French and Italian, or can we use this model but tweak the language in some way? And certainly we'll look to those experts in the field and those fluent in those languages to help us out in those areas.
So can we discuss the ways in which the tool opens up the collection, like we talked about yesterday? So, for example, how could we feed into automated text readers?
Yes, I think this is something that Elise and I have discussed about the potential for the tool, not just to open up access in terms of making the material available in the public domain online, remotely, so that people can access remotely without actually having to visit physically the Centre for Research Collections, but also because it's a typed transcription, then the issues with the handwriting become less problematic, and so there's a much broader audience that's then able to access. I mean, we ourselves have found the handwriting on some days really challenging, and we're both trained in that line of work. So if we want that material and those ideas to be used in schools or secondary schools, then having the typed transcriptions is one of the ways in which we can make the material more accessible. But the automated text readers is obviously a real boon, because then we're reaching into the realms of blind people or partially sighted,
Wow.
that can then access that material with whatever support they need from that. But it just opens up the body of material to a much broader audience. I don't know if you want to add anything in. Oh, sorry, Daryl's got his hand up here.
Yeah, I mean, going back to an earlier point, the real push for this project is to make this collection as accessible as possible, because it is so multifarious. Lyle, because of his status in society, but also because of his scientific pursuit, traveled a lot. Ran into a lot of different people, went to a lot of different countries, saw a lot of different things. So, in terms of making those resources accessible, and prying out some of that data from behind the hand that's there, just means that is that much more accessible. So in terms of who might want to study the notebooks, from the geological standpoint, of course, but from the folks interested in the history of tourism to Italy, or folks interested in the early 19th century history of the United States. Lyle was traveling to these places and seeing these things and running into people. If you're interested in high society or dining etiquette or travel, all these kind of things are there. But it's like making that findable and accessible is really what the transcription does for us.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think the ability to add on then another layer of tools on top of that when you've got the transcriptions available. So if you wanted to say, for example, look at mapping out and presenting a visual representation of where Lyle travelled to, or his correspondence and where they're located. I think he corresponds with people in Europe and in the United States. And we are thinking about the possibility of either creating an internship or a student experience placement that looks at how we might use linked data and how we might extract data from the transcriptions in order to create another data set, which then produces either a visual representation or another way of presenting the information that can be used for different research purposes.
So we've got a nice question from Grace, who says, does the model pick up language no longer used in today's world?
I can jump in on that. If Grace is talking about Transcribus in general, I'd say that Transcribus is as strong as the public public models that have been made available. So from the models that have been created for the community to use, we selected one that is based on 19th century handwriting to go underneath Lyle's own handwriting. So there's sort of a foundation of handwritten knowledge the model is using on top of Lyle's written language. And so if there is another language out there, and Joe might be able to jump in on this, is sort of if you're talking about those sort of ancient Greek or Latin, then if there are those models out there, and there were loads of languages, there was 3 for English, but there is a very, very long list on the other languages. So yeah, Joe says that the Latin model is actually the strongest. So wow. There's lots that the community has been working really hard, and I think is a very generous community in sharing things open source, allowing other collections to benefit from the models that have been created. So that doesn't surprise me. Yeah, up from the founder. Lovely.
Wow. Cool. So once you're happy with the transcriptions, where's a good place for them to go? How do we share them? How do we embed them in IIIF manifests, for example? What should we do? Blank faces.
Yeah. So I mean, this is the great next step, right? Is once you've gone through the work of creating transcriptions, then what do you do with them? Certainly, IIIF has, or there's demonstrated ability with IIIF to make the transcriptions part of a manifest. So that data moves with the image when you pull down a manifest, a IIIF manifest. But we at Edinburgh, we haven't really experimented with that before, so we would need to figure out how that works. Certainly, you could dump all the transcripts into a number of different, machine reading engines. You could put them into a database so they could be full text searched and explored. but there's also something to be said about keeping the text married to the image, so you can always relate back to the original, and if you wanted to pull up the physical copy as well. So these are kind of question marks that we're just starting to think about. It's taken a lot of mental effort to get to the point of creating the model and kind of understanding what that model looks like, what that process looks like. And we're just now starting to grapple with what to do with the product afterwards.
So what advice would you give to somebody who has a collection that they would like to start trying to train a model with transcribers to transcribe? What are your big takeaways that you think would be really useful for someone who had a nice corpus that would cover enough to train?
Well, I'll jump in on that. I think that that a knowledge of the handwriting to begin with, or sort of a tested ability to be able to transcribe using training in Transcribus, but also knowledge of the collection is important. We had our two interns, Nikki Monroe particularly, was already familiar with Lyle's hand, and that helped him and aided him in using Transcribus. But even then, I think Transcribus is just a good drafting tool of drafting transcriptions, compared to using just a Word document and looking at an image and copying in, or an Excel spreadsheet. I think Transcribus, even when you don't even go near a model, it still is a great way of working, because the images can be shared within a team. You can keep track of your work by selecting the status of each page, whether it's in progress or whether it's been finished. And so even just by those capacities, I think it's a really strong tool for any collection has been digitized, and wants to go forward with creating those transcriptions.
Yeah, I think the other, sorry, Anthony, I was just going to say, I think the other thing to mention is that, and Elise will perhaps agree, that the model that we used in terms of the human resource for the Transcribers project was a really good one, in that we were using interns and now volunteers. So we have 2 volunteers on the team, both of whom, one is an undergraduate student who's volunteered with the Centre for Research Collections since he started in first year, who is on a trajectory to a career in archives, because he is, Michael, he's just so dedicated that he's going to get there. And so he came to us in first year as an undergrad. And then also a qualified archivist, who has an archives postgrad qualification, who's volunteering with us. And now we've got that model set up in terms of the human resource side of things. Elise has done a wonderful job in terms of the workflows. And I think Transcribus is not just a great tool, just to kind of agree with Elise there, that it's not just a great tool for doing the transcription, but actually to manage the workflow, it's also a great tool. And so it does allow you to engage with volunteer resource or a student, providing student experience through kind of the project, and actually to have quite a significant output using that model.
Amazing. Yeah, good.
I'll just add that a little point there is that we spoke yesterday about that there's the app and there's also the light web version, and I'd really recommend anyone that's looking at it, because you can involve team members without requiring them to download the application. And for anybody who's seen the application, it can be a bit daunting. There's lots of tiny buttons, so when working with volunteers, that light web version is so handy to be able to just transcribe quickly and easily without worrying about a load of other features.
So we've got 10 minutes left. Come on, people who are listening, can you give us some questions? You've got the experts here ready to answer you. But I've got another one. So how did we choose which notebooks to digitize first, and how are we going to choose the next set?
Do you want me to take this, Elise? Yeah, okay, that's fine. So the first lot were chosen for conservation purposes. So the conservation drove the digitisation. So we knew that we wanted to get those digitised first, because if they were to be accessed thereafter, it was going to potentially create further damage to the notebooks. So that's another factor to kind of think about when you're looking at what you're going to use Transcribus for, and because you're going to have digitised images anyway. So they were driven by conservation, and then there'll probably be so we've digitized 12 completely.
Wow.
So there's 280 to go, and conservation will probably drive the priorities for the remainder in the first instance, and then there'll be a reassessment of where the research needs are and whether we do them in order, just to make things keep things easily to track, to be able to keep track of things easily, and if there's anything that's within the notebooks that we're really excited about in terms of the research potential, then we'll obviously look at those too, because there's quite a high demand from different research areas, and we keep getting emails into the inbox saying, when's this one going to be digitised? When is this one going to be digitised? Because my research is covering this area. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but we'll take all of those things into consideration and then look at the priorities for the next lot.
And can the research... sorry, Darryl.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, we do know, for example, there's specific points in his life where he's traveling and doing a lot more in his notebooks as well. And there's a lot of research interest in, his trip to Italy, for example, or his several trips to North America. And so, those would be priority. But as Elaine said, transcribus is really, the third or fourth step in quite a long workflow already, and then not the final step either. So, we have to take a lot into consideration before we get to the transcription stage.
Okay, we're getting some questions. So Suzanne's asking, do you think it's important to create a basic level of metadata for uncatalogued material before you digitize, or has your experience during the pandemic made you think differently? Good point.
Yeah. From a personal perspective, I think it's essential.
Of course. I knew
I'm an archivist. So I think it's essential. I think the pandemic has made us think differently in thinking about what, it doesn't need to be absolutely completely comprehensive and include absolutely everything. What can be factored in? As long as you also think through, if you're going with one level of metadata at the beginning, you have to think through the future resource that's required in order to either update that or refine that metadata once you've done the cataloguing. So we've got this issue here with our project, in that we've got a range of digitised images with a quite sort of limited set of metadata, so that we can at least match up the digitised image with the catalogue reference number and description. But we'll be adding description content to the catalogue, and we would want to see that also added to the digitised image. And you have to think through about what resource may be required in order to update that metadata afterwards. So that that's something we're thinking through as well.
Yeah, and I would also say, just in terms of our colleagues who are in charge of the digitization, they need metadata. They both create and need metadata. So in terms of not disassociating image to object. So they're in many ways, transcribus or transcription projects are they're additive to what is still a very much needed human element to the metadata creation.
Absolutely. So Kyle's asked, sorry.
I just want to add that I think maybe you could speak to, as well as the preservation element of this, and introducing our Gooby platform into this, and that now is another step which needs to be considered when thinking about metadata. But the question is a beautiful one, in the sense that at home, the only way I could work was with the digital or the digitized notebooks, and that actually completely changed the way that I work, but also the way that we are used to working with the notebooks. And now when I do go into the stores and work with a notebook, it has just a sense of familiarity, because I've stared at an image of this page for hours, which I normally would never have wanted to do that for conservation purposes. And so in some ways, that digitization happening first, or one of the first things to happen, has allowed cataloging to go from a surrogate, which is perhaps a new frontier, than has previously been used, as the surrogate is for public research or for public use. But in this sense, all of the cataloging and metadata has been drawn out from that surrogate rather than from the original.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, no, the digital preservation is definitely on my mind. And, the digital preservation standards require you to have a base level of metadata. So you have to find this balance somewhere before it gets pushed off to digital preservation. And if you want to push it off before you have the time to make it a complete set of metadata, then you're going to have to push another one across once you've completed that metadata. So there's lots to take into consideration there. So we've got a few more questions and 4 more minutes, all happening at the end. So Kyle's asking, have you created an advisory committee of stakeholders, researchers, educators, administrators, and how frequently do you engage with them in this project? Good question.
Yeah, I'll take that. So we do have an advisory board for the overall Lyle project, which encompasses all of what we've been talking about, but also our public engagement, community engagement, academic engagement. That advisory board is a mix of academics, cultural heritage professionals, subject experts, and so on. We meet once every 3 months, so quarterly, but they're also regularly, available for us to sound questions off of, and especially as Elaine has come up to speed on the project, and as we've had some rather gnarly issues, just in terms of what is Word, or what is Lyle talking about. The advisory board has been really, really helpful in kind of helping us get off our feet.
That's great. And then Joel's saying, you mentioned yesterday that Lyle's field notes are far messier. Will a separate model for transcribers be necessary?
I thought this as well, actually, that we might need to do this, but we specifically chose the two notebooks which we transcribed. One is perhaps more neater and is draft letters, which are easier to transcribe as well because there's more context given. And the other was a notebook of every description of every handwriting, every subject, sketches and annotations and sort of all sorts, lots and lots of different variety there. And so those two were chosen because we hoped that this would build a really robust model that could handle the different handwriting which he has, and so far it has proven to be able to handle those things. With as I said yesterday, the basically the generated transcript is the errors that are made are simple spell check, which is hopefully we can also automate those errors to be cleaned up in time as well. So at the moment, I don't think we'll need to create another model, but it certainly is something we can think of, in the future.
So one final question from Alison, who's saying, do you think this approach has encouraged you to use simpler archival arrangements and hierarchies? How do these records look in archive space?
Do you want me to take that? I'll take that. So we were quite blessed in a sense that when we received the collections, they were the family, they had been in private hands and they were owned by the Lyle family, and there had been significant work done around the arrangement and listing and creating data sets. So we didn't adjust the arrangement. So in this instance, the doing the transcription didn't impact on how we were going to arrange the collection or whether it needed to be rearranged in the provenance, because it came to us in an arrangement that we were happy with and felt reflected how the collection was created and how it was cared for, and that we could keep track of the different accruals and respect the provenance of the collections in the catalogue.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Amazing. Well, that's great. We've hit our 45 minutes. Well done, everybody. That was very, very informative. And again, such a wonderful and rich collection. And it's going to be amazing over the years to see that content being exposed. So we've got another 15-minute break now. And then we're going to come back and we're going to have Mike talking us through his editor tool again, and everybody getting a shot at having a go. Okay.